Good evening, everyone. We are blessed to have some folks joining us online, so we do want to be timely in getting started tonight. On behalf of First Congregational United Church of Christ, a congregation that is joyful and justice-seeking here in the heart of our nation's capital, I am just delighted to welcome you all for this evening and our conversation with Dr. Robert P. Jones about white Christian nationalism and the 2024 elections. My name is the Reverend Amanda Hendler-Voss, and I serve as the senior minister here at First Church. I want to offer a special welcome. We at First Church are hosting the Young Clergy Women International Conference over the next couple of days. Yes. And so I want to offer a special welcome to all those powerful, brilliant clergy women who are taking time out of their night, and to all of you who are taking time out of your night for this very important conversation. Thank you for being here. We're so glad. As I look out, I also see colleagues from across the DC metro area, and I don't wish to speak for you, but I do know that ministering here in the nation's capital, we feel acutely the pressure of white Christian nationalism and what it means for our city, for the life of our country, for the life of our church, whether it is roving bands of white supremacists out on our streets, whether it is the January 6th insurrection or the threat to hollow out the civil service. We feel acutely the effects of all that we're going to discuss tonight. This is a very important conversation at a crucial time in the life of our nation. And so I'm just so grateful that you're here. A few housekeeping items. If you are seeking a bathroom, there is a hallway right out there. There are bathrooms on the left-hand side of that. There are also other bathrooms upstairs in a similar location. If you drove in today and parked in our lot, your parking can get validated. The validator machine is out where the books are being sold, and you just follow the instructions right on the top. You can get your ticket validated. I want to caution you against wrinkling and folding that ticket. It will make all of our lives much easier if you keep that very, very slick. We like to say in the United Church of Christ, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. And I extend that welcome not only to all of you, but also to the Spirit of the living God. We are in the season of Pentecost for those of us who identify as Christian. And the Holy Spirit is already here in our midst and at work. And so let us be mindful tonight as we enter into this time together about how God is moving in our hearts and moving in our midst tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to our Associate Conference Minister, the Reverend Marvin Silver.
Thank you, Pastor Amanda, and to First Church DC for opening your doors so that we can gather in community here this evening and be in conversation about important issues that impact the church and this nation. I not only serve as the Associate Conference Minister for our churches in the Potomac Association and Chesapeake Association here in the Central Atlantic Conference, but I also serve as Director of our Justice and Witness Action Network. So I want to thank all of you who are members for your ongoing efforts to make that work possible. I'm happy this evening because the Spirit is at work. The Spirit was at work amongst you, our leaders of our Justice and Witness Action Network, who called for such a conversation. And it also fit in line with our plans for this year's Faith and Democracy 2024 campaign. So this is our first voter education forum, White Christian Nationalism and the 2024 elections. And we hope that this forum will be the first of many for the remainder of this election cycle. This year's campaign is organized around faith and democratic principles of valuing and affirming the voice and dignity of all, especially the least of these among us, and the belief that every person has a right to participate fully, freely, and fairly in the democratic process without fear, intimidation, and limitations or false information. This campaign is in response to the ongoing threats to our democracy and the right to vote. So why are we here? We are here because this nation was built on white supremacy and white Christian nationalism, some would say. And voting was enshrined, as we all know, only for educated white men who own property. People of color, Native Americans, women, people with disabilities, and the poor had to fight to secure access to the franchise over the centuries. This country, our country, cannot legitimately claim to be a representative democracy when it dehumanizes and bans huge segments of the population from lifting up their voice to prevent them from voting. The language of our American democracy is voting, and our ability to participate in public life, to have a voice in choosing who will be our elected officials, who make decisions that impact our lives, our families, and our communities, is at the core of what it truly means to be an American. I believe, and I'm sure that you would agree, that our democracy works best when all of our voices are heard. A democracy that doesn't provide its citizens the opportunity to participate in elections cannot successfully impact and create the lasting change on the urgent issues that plague our nation. We remember just 3-4 years ago, on January 6th, the world witnessed the truth of who we are as a nation when a few thousand predominantly white domestic terrorists, many brandishing firearms and other weapons, displaying Christian symbols and chanting white Christian nationalist messages, attacked our nation's capital and our democracy. It is these acts of racial injustice and the ongoing denial of what really happened that day present us as the church with the moral imperative to take action against these growing threats to our democracy. A 21st century democracy that represents our growing diverse nation is imperative. A democracy that welcomes every person's voice and participation no matter who they are. This is our vision. This is what we deserve. This is what we should demand. This is what we must fight for. And with that, I'm happy that we are gathered here tonight to continue in that justice spirit of the United Church of Christ, to come forward in this Kairos moment, this now moment, as the church, the local church, to take an unequivocal stand against the evils of systemic racism and white Christian nationalism, and to take the steps towards becoming the beloved community. With that being said, I'm going to invite up now Pastor Matt Braddock of Christ Congregational Church to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Great, thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing a remarkable individual whose work and vision have been pivotal in our ongoing journey towards understanding and healing. Robert P. Jones is not just the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, he's a beacon of insight and a catalyst for change. Robbie's journey is nothing short of inspiring, with a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS in Computing Science and Mathematics from Mississippi College. His academic prowess is matched only by his dedication for truth and justice. An acclaimed author, Robbie's words have resonated far and wide. His latest book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, is a New York Times bestseller, echoing the profound impact of his earlier works, like White Too Long and The End of White Christian America. These books are not just bestsellers, they are catalysts for conversation. And these are conversations that are uncomfortable, and they're necessary. They push us to confront the legacy of white supremacy embedded in American Christianity. Robbie's books have been pivotal for those of us who worked on the curriculum for dismantling white supremacy in our churches. As Robbie reminds us in his book, White Too Long, white Christianity has been many things for America, But whatever else it has been, and the country is indebted to it for a good many things, it has also been the primary institution legitimizing and propagating white power and dominance. Robbie's work is not just historical, but also quantifiable. For instance, his polling shows how general support for protests drop when protesters are described as Black Americans. Robbie is not just a scholar hidden away in a DC think tank. His voice is a familiar one, heard regularly on platforms like CNN, MSNBC, NPR, read in The Atlantic and Time, The Washington Post, and Sojourners. In his media work, he is dedicated to truth-telling, to repair, to healing, to reminding us of the work that's still to be done. Robbie's presence here tonight is a call to action. He himself has said the choice in front of us today is whether we work for healing and repair or whether we are going to deny it. His work challenges us to choose the path of truth and reconciliation. So please join me in welcoming the indefatigable Robert P. Jones.
All right, I've got to bring Matt with me on the road wherever I go. Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you for being here tonight with me. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Is the truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife? Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. You better never tell nobody but God, it'd kill your mammy. I am an invisible man. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Beginnings matter, as these memorable opening lines to novels and famous books attest. They grab us by the lapels, they focus our attention, they intrigue us. They bring into the frame fragments of an entire world that is going to unfold before us as we read. Why are the clocks striking 13? What's the nature of gender roles in marriage in this social world? What rights are humans born with? What does it mean for a child to be given permission to tell God but not her mother a horrific family secret? How is a man invisible? What's at stake in asserting an act of creation by a singular God? Beginnings allow specific things and questions to snap into focus. But as these opening collections of syllables reveal, they also hide. Like a photo taken in portrait mode, the field of focus narrows, and other things fade into an indistinct blur in the background or recede altogether in the shadows. Our in the beginnings, our once upon a times, are never neutral. They issue an invoice that the rest of the story has to pay. And ultimately, the story is only accountable to what is in that initial frame. Now, I know we're here tonight to talk about Christian nationalism and the 2024 elections, right? That's what you all came to hear about. But to understand our present, we need to go back, and we need to go back a few centuries. So I'm going to start with a story that helps us see some difficult truths about our nation and ourselves. In fact, it is the story that I began the newest book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, with. So if you'll kind of just go on this little journey with me here as I kind of lay out this image in which I think some of our present troubles are revealed in this story. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade raft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin making plans to escape north. The Hickman party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children on board, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight and knowing the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesota with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as his final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee in Lower Town on the outskirts of St. Paul. Local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft. As they did so, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that St. Paul police arrived on the scene. We need more of it? Okay. Yes. All right. Better. All right. Arrived on the scene. But after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with his trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th, but they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people, who had been held under armed guard all winter following the Dakota War of the year before in a miserable encampment in a lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation from their ancestral homelands to a bleak reservation in the Nebraska Territory. By the time the ice finally melted and the river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo. 547 Dakota people, whom he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on them, for they shall receive none from man." Neither Hickman and his companions nor the Dakota people would have had the perspective to realize they were witnessing the momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River, that the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. So this encounter on May 5th, 1863 contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri and the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters and stories of indigenous people populating this land for millennia? Or do we portage east and cross the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. So one of the things I'm trying to do in this newest book is to hold together histories that we often keep apart. Histories of African enslavement and segregation on the one hand, on one track of history, and histories of genocide and deportation, mass removal among Native Americans in the other. And to think about that and kind of hold those two questions together and ask us, if we hold those two things together, what does it tell us about who we are as a country, right? How do we get here? And so we certainly see European interactions fueled by the idea that the superiority of European civilization entitled them to the land and labor of others. That's fundamentally what we see in this picture. But as troubling as that is, it doesn't capture the whole truth, the audacity of the claim, which is necessary to understand our present. We have to grasp the foundational role that Christian theology and Christian institutions wielded as weapons, played in justifying those claims of superiority. So to set the table, I'm going to kind of just take a few minutes and unpack a kind of key Christian doctrine that I think is still with us today. It began in the 15th century, and it is still with us today. Some of you may have heard about it. I didn't actually know that much about it until I started doing research of the book. It's called the doctrine of discovery, right? It is a worldview, I think, still at the root of many of our present divides. So in the last 10 years, across 3 books, I've been on a journey to try to uncover the truth about really my own history, raised Southern Baptist in Mississippi, and the way that our larger history relates to 3 identities that have been central to my own sense of self, being white, being Christian, and being American. And I'm still amazed at the power of these 3 interlocking identities to obscure the plain testimony of history and the stark realities of the present. I've been struck by the ability of Christianity in particular to project for us a history of impossible innocence, both by hiding and denying our heritage. So just a few years ago, we had a debate about American beginnings that really boiled over into the public, fought on many fronts. I only have to give you a year and you will know what I'm talking about. 1619. Right? The 1619 Project caused this huge cultural uproar in the country, and it was opposed to 1776 was the thing asserted on the other side of it. So what's going on, right? Why was that such a huge deal? Why did it set off the backlash that it did? And I think it's partially back to this because our in the beginnings really matter, right, for our present. And so the key question is like, what is in the frame? Right, with whatever beginning story we have. We go back to we're in a Christian space here, so we go back to that opening words of Genesis. In the beginning, God. Right, and what we have there, of course, is an assertion of monotheism. Right, so whatever else we have going on after that, we know there is the story to be told about a single God who created everything that there is. Right, we in just 5 words we have it, or 4 words we have it right there. And so when I was a kid, I grew up in the 70s, so during the sort of bicentennial thing, and I remember collecting stamps. In 1976, they issued a stamp that was a copy of a painting, and it was 1776, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You can probably all picture it in your head. It's all the white dudes in Philadelphia in their knickers and colonial finery, all awkwardly posed with their quill pens, so you can see them all in the frame, right? And if we tell a story that is in the beginning, that picture, there's only a certain kind of story we have to tell after that, right? When we begin that story. And I think that's part of what was going on because the 1619 Project, and I think one thing that got lost actually that I keep wanting to retrieve is that when it was first published in the New York Times, it came with an image. Does anybody remember the image? I think most people don't. Can anybody kind of dial that back up from that initial printing? It was close. There was an ocean. Yes, it was a vast horizon line, right? This empty ocean, right? And it was meant to evoke, right, the transatlantic slave trade. And so it had it had a date and a story, but it had an image with it. And so if you start with that image, and it was black, it was really a black and white image, monochromatic image with this kind of dark, almost black ocean, this flat horizon line all the way across in this gray sky. And so if that's the in the beginning, that image, you have to tell a very different story about how we got here, who we are, and who the we, right, is in the frame, right? We have to kind of tell a different frame. So I want to say you got a hearty yes and to that move. And the and part of it is kind of tied to the doctrine of discovery. And I want to suggest that, yes, like breaking the hold of 1776 on our collective imaginations was massive cultural achievement, right? And then moving, I think we need to keep moving, though, a little bit further and kind of suggest we bring the camera back a little bit further. And there's nothing magic about any particular date, but I want to suggest that one date we ought to all kind of have in our lexicons going forward is not just 1776, not just 1619, but one more if we kind of keep coming back, and that is 1493. Right? So not 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as many of us were taught in elementary school, but the next year, all right? I never get taught about what happened in 1493. I get taught about what happened the first year. So what happens in 1493? So Columbus goes back, and he still doesn't really know where he is, by the way, but he goes back and he says, I found these wonderful things, and I need to be resupplied to make another trip. Right? And here's what I need. I need more soldiers. I need more ships. I need more supplies. But the thing that often gets overlooked is that he also asks for a specific moral mandate for what he was about to do. Right? And so who does he appeal for that moral mandate? Well, it's not to the queen and king. It's to the church that he asked for this moral mandate. Because, the first contact in the Americas across the latter half of the 15th century, really beginning like 1452 to 1493, had caused a kind of theological crisis. Because here were all these people and these lands that no one knew existed. And so the real question was, what rights do these people have that we're bound to respect? We Europeans are bound to respect. That's the question they put to the church. And at that time, I know we're in a Protestant space here, but just a reminder to everyone before you get too smug, if you're Protestant, this is before the Protestant Reformation. This is before, if you're Anglican, this is before the break with the Church of England. So everyone in Western Europe is under the authority of is essentially Catholic, under the authority of the Pope in Rome. And so the popes began to issue these theological opinions to basically map out here's what rights these people have. And the way there's a great website at doctrineofdiscovery.org that you can actually go see the original documents. If you read Latin, you can read them in Latin, but they also have them translated into English. And if you look at these documents, what you really see in a series of them, again, between 1452 and 1493, was a working out of a theology, right, of domination. And that's what you see in these documents. And they basically, if you boil it all down, they answered the question of what rights do these people have with their own question. And that threshold question that they asked was, well, are they Christian? And of course, they knew the answer to that question, right? Well, no, they're not Christian. If they were not Christian, then everything falls out very neatly. If they're not Christian, they are to be considered, and this is in the documents, enemies of Christ, right? Of this very kind of bellicose language right at the beginning. And if they are enemies of Christ and they refuse to convert, then you can take their land, you can take their goods, and then it even spells out, again, in black and white from the head of the church, the head of the Christian church in the West, and you have the right to submit their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? That is like in the documents there. This, my friends, is the version of Christianity that lands on our shores. So that is our in the beginning here. And I think we are still wrestling with the reality, right, of that beginning and taking that in and being honest about that beginning and how that has sort of warped and set the course for so much of what has followed here. And I want to say just a little bit about how this is embedded. Now, you might think, okay, well, in theory, yes, that's true. But it has been embedded in very concrete ways and is still with us. And if you have the eyes to see, you can really even see it. So I'll start with a couple of things. The Declaration of Independence. We think of it as stating all these principles of rights and all of that, and that is unalienable rights and all of that. That is true. But if you keep reading, there's a whole set of grievances, right, against the king. And when you read through there, you will hear this. He, the king, this is the complaint, has excited domestic insurrections upon us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And that domestic insurrections, those are slave rebellions that they're complaining about, that the king has encouraged enslaved people to rebel. In the Constitution, famously, you've already mentioned this, Section 2, right? Straightforwardly excludes Indians and counts enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, but then only for the purpose of increasing their white owners' power, right, in the Constitution. In our Supreme Court law, there's a case called Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823 that explicitly gives this doctrine of discovery as the legal basis for dispossessing indigenous people in this country. So it says this is from the hand of Chief Justice John Marshall. Quote, "The character and religion of the New World's inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. The potentates of the Old World found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they had made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the New by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity." So that's the basis of Supreme Court law. One that was surprising to me is that the last time that I can find that the doctrine of discovery was explicitly cited in a Supreme Court case was 2005. Footnote number 1, penned by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, cites the doctrine of discovery as a reason to deny the Oneida Nation the ability to reincorporate some land into their current reservation. Right, so it's still, very much with us. Unless you think it's all kind of legal and in that side of things, one quick polling number here. We decided to ask on a public opinion survey. Well, let's just see how many Americans believe this basic tenet, and we'll just put it as straightforward as we can. So we asked, do you agree or disagree that America was designated by God to be a promised land for European Christians? Like, that's how we put it on the survey. Turns out that 3 in 10 Americans agree with that statement, right? Now, so you can say well, that's 2/3 of the country that rejects it. That is true. But there is 1 in 3 who affirm that statement, and there's 2 groups among whom it is a majority opinion. Those 2 groups are white evangelical Protestants, my people, that I grew up with, and self-identified Republicans. Today is a majority opinion in those two groups, and that's kind of part of what's with us. So in the past, I think it was common for even well-meaning liberal whites to talk about, you'll see this in writings all across the 20th century, the so-called Negro problem, right, or the so-called Indian problem. But the analysis and rereading our history like this, I think reveals that if we push past the so-called Negro problem and the Indian problem, at the headwaters, we're going to find something else. And that is the white Christian problem at the headwaters of that trajectory. We have to have, as Jesus puts it in the Gospels, eyes to see. So I'll close with this. Shortly after the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in July of 1968, and against the backdrop of American cities, including this one, burning, James Baldwin gave this sharp response to a white Esquire magazine interviewer who asked him how the country could get rioting African Americans to, quote, cool it. So if you know anything about Baldwin, you can guess, what's coming here. But he says this. He just kind of looks at the guy and he says, all that can save you now is your confrontation with your own history, which is not your past, but your present. Your history has led you to this moment. And you can only begin to change yourself by looking at what you were doing in the name of your history. So Baldwin's assessment from 50 years ago was certainly right. And we're still struggling mightily to confront, honestly, our own history. And if we're going to save ourselves, it's past time for us to open our story with a more honest, inclusive in the beginning, one that has all of us in the frame. And for those of us who are white and Christian, that must include our confrontation with the way we've allowed our faith to underwrite the white supremacist vision of the doctrine of discovery. With the light cast from a more honest beginning, we might finally answer the question that's really at the heart, and here I'll get to the 2024 elections, that is at the heart, I think, of our elections this cycle. This fundamental question, are we a pluralistic democracy where everyone stands on equal footing before the law, or are we a promised land for European Christians? Which of these are we? And if we can muster the courage to finally embrace that former vision of a pluralistic democracy, I think only then will we finally find the path to a shared American future. Thank you.
Okay, we've come to the time in our evening when we get to ask a few prepared questions, after which we will turn it over to all of you for questions that you might wish to ask. And so just delighted to be joined here by Carleen Ponder. And Carleen, if you want to briefly introduce yourself and tell us what church you're with, and go ahead with your first question.
Hi, everybody. Carleen Ponder, and I'm a member of Christ Congregational Church in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I lead our Justice and Witness Ministry. And as a matter of fact, we just had a conversation about white Christian nationalism at our church that people found very enlightening. So thank you for being here. I've seen you in the media, CNN very regularly, and I remember prior to the 2016 election, visiting churches. I like to visit churches across the country and hearing what I thought was drummed up support for active participation in the election, but in a way that sort of set off alarm bells for me. And I can see that happening again. And I'm wondering, how do we counter that in a way that allows us to be Christian, be passionate, be vocal, but not to become this other side? So your thoughts on that?
So you're going to start with a small question.
Small question.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so I think that, one of the things that's been so striking to me is the way that fear has taken over, right? And particularly in predominantly white Christian spaces. So in 2016, I wrote a book called The End of White Christian America. And I wrote that book because I was looking at the data, and I think one of the things that has set off the fear is the way the country is changing, right? Demographically changing, culturally changing. And so just to kind of put it historically, if you have that vision of who this country is of, by, and for, and it's God wants it to be a white Christian country, and then you start seeing the country changing away from that, it does set off, I think, the sense of vertigo, the sense of fear, this reactionary thing. And I think that's the kind of virus that is infected, particularly white Christian churches and congregations. But just to kind of give you the numbers, so if we go back to kind of 2008, when just 2 election cycles before 2016, when of course we had our first African American president elected, in that election, if you look at the country was still a majority white and Christian. So if you put all white Christians together, Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational, what you have it is 54% white and Christian. By the time we get to the 2016 election, we have crossed this threshold for being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian country. It went from 54 to 47 by 2016. And so part of these appeals that Trump was making to white evangelical audiences in particular was like, look, you're declining, and I'm the one who's going to restore you to power. I mean, this was an explicit appeal that he made on the campaign trail. And by the way, that number today, so it's 54% 2008, 47% in 2016. That number today is 42, right? So it's just continued to slide. And I think that sense of kind of no longer having the demographic dominance has set off all kinds of fear. It's also set off a kind of permission structure to do things outside of democratic procedures because the numbers just aren't there to win on a straight up vote.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask what you think is at stake for us as people of faith, as Americans in this election, and how do you expect white Christian nationalism to be at play in this election cycle?
Yeah. Well, I'll say a little bit more about white Christian nationalism. So that label is a fairly new one, actually, right? And probably in the last 5 years where it's kind of coming into common parlance. It's been in political science and social science circles a little longer than that, but I'll explain what we mean by that because I think it's important to define it. So we did a survey with the, at PRRI, did a survey with the Brookings Institution in 2023. And we decided to define it with about 5 statements, and they were things like this. The U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation. U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. In order to be truly American, one has to be Christian. So it was a set of things like that, these kind of claims to Christians as a dominant, rightfully a dominant and a dominant force in the country. And historically, right, that has always had a whiteness attached to it, right? We even have this kind of other common term, WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? And that is because that has been the big power structure in the country has been around white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so what we have, I think, is when we measure it like that, we find, you'll hear this number again, it's 30% of the country. That even measuring it like that, we get about 3 in 10 who we classify as either Christian nationalism adherents, and those are people who strongly agree with all 5 of these statements that we used in the survey, or sympathizers, and those are people who mostly agree with all 5 of those statements. So again, 2/3 of the country kind of leans away from that vision, but it's a strong kind of non-negligible minority of the country. And again, over the groups that are majority, even measuring it like that, are white evangelical Protestants and Republicans, both fall majority, affirming those statements. One challenge we have in the country is, one more thing to add to this, is that our 2 political parties have sorted themselves, of course, along ideological lines, but the other ways they've sorted themselves are along ethno-religious lines, right? So today, the self-identified Republicans are 70% white and Christian, right? In a country that is 42% white and Christian. The self-identified Democrats are 25% white and Christian, right? So we essentially have kind of one political party that has become the kind of white Christian party, and I think been fed a diet of grievance, and I think it has really become taken over. I was just listening to a speech that former President Trump gave both in Dallas and in St. Paul, Minnesota, just over the last week, and he's saying things like on the campaign trail to mostly white, mostly Christian audiences, this country is your country. It's not theirs. Your country, not theirs. It's your ancestors who fought to achieve this country, not theirs, right? So there's just this explicit, allusion to who are the rightful people to be in power. Well, they're white Christian people. So I think that's what's at stake, really, in this election. And I don't think that's at stake. I think it's mostly at stake because of the way that Make America Great Again movement has taken over the Republican Party and made this the face of the election and the divides of the country.
Well, thank you, and thank you for touching on race. You have to talk about race when we're using that term, white Christian nationalism. Yeah. And I like having the term white Christian nationalism. I recognize it as a new term, but it helps to package these set of ideas. Makes it a little bit easier to talk about. But I grew up in the Black church. For a long, long time, the recognition of white supremacy and its taint on what we recognize as large-scale Christianity or maybe mainstream Christianity was known to me.
Of course.
But yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But I talked to lots of other people who grew up in the mainstream church, white people who grew up in the mainstream church, and I'm afraid they don't see how white supremacy has undergirded or tainted or even infected that brand of Christianity. And I don't know who has the responsibility for doing some of that disentangling, that detangling work, right? Is it clergy? Who's going to do it?
Well, I hope anybody who thinks of themselves as white and Christian will feel the responsibility. I mean, I think that's part of what I've been trying to hold up. But it is in our DNA. I mean, it is so deeply. It's in our liturgy. It is in our preferences for what we preach on. It is in our hymns. I can remember growing up singing like, "Wash me and I will be whiter than snow, Lord, whiter than snow," right? And all that imagery of like whiteness being associated with purity, blackness being associated with sin, Jesus being white, right? I mean, and no joke that the image the image that humans have reproduced the most times of any other image in human history is an image of white Jesus. Right? It's that you can probably picture it in your head right now if you try a little bit. That Aryan white Jesus, we're kind of looking very serenely off like this, kind of, sandy blonde hair, clearly Caucasian. It turns out it was actually, the first time it was actually produced for a Scandinavian youth magazine. And then it just kind of went loose, right? And but I think that idea of white Jesus, whenever I'm in church with stained glass, I'm always looking around to like see, is Paul white? Is Moses white? Is Jesus white? On all the stained glass. I think it's so deeply in us, and I think it's, and especially in the American context. I mean, it's 4 centuries, right, of it being in American. I mean, for God's sake, we built it into our architecture, right? We had like slave galleries, like up there, right, who had separate entrances for enslaved people who were forced to come to a white church and sit up there, right? And if you ask yourself, like, seriously, so what kind of service could one have in that context, right? What could the white preacher standing up here not preach on? What Bible readings could not happen? Are you going to read, "In Christ there's no slave nor free, no Jew nor Greek"? And that's like, I don't think so. Are you going to preach on Pentecost and freedom of the Spirit? Or are you going to preach on the Exodus? Probably not, right? And in fact, we know that that's true because like Fisk University, the Museum of the Bible, which I would not recommend going to, but it did have it did have in its possession, on loan from Fisk University, what they called the Enslaver's Bible. And it was a Bible made in England for use with people who had ministry to enslaved people in the West Indies. And they essentially cut out those verses that I just said. So it had the book of Exodus in it because they couldn't quite get rid of the whole book, but it stopped with the enslavement of the Israelites. There was no freedom in the book of Exodus, right? It had slaves obey your masters, but not in Christ there's no slave nor free, no Jew nor Greek. It like literally just cut those things out. So if an enslaved person got their hands on it and was literate, it just wouldn't be in there. I've now forgotten what the question was, but yeah. But I think we have a responsibility to take all that really seriously, because I do think it is really shaped. One other way that I think it shaped it. One of the most powerful things that it did in the white church is narrow our sense of sin to individual things between your ears or in your emotions. And so I can tell you for a fact, I was a kid. I went to church 5 days a week as a Southern Baptist kid in the youth group, and I was there all the time. I was also in public school in Jackson, Mississippi, in 1976, our bicentennial year, when our public school finally got integrated. 22 years after Brown v. Board, right? And did our church have anything to say about that? Nothing, right? Absolute silence. So our entire social world turns over. We had our first black teachers, first African-American classmates, and like no adults in our lives are telling us anything about what that's about or what's going on. And nor did I ever hear a sermon on racial justice of any kind going on. And I think by the 80s we did sneak in readings for Martin Luther King, but it was always the rosy black and white people holding hands together kind of stuff. It was not Letter from Birmingham Jail. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, last question from us, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Sort of building off the last question, in some ways it feels like bad theology got us into this, although I know bad theology was a bit of a justification for the nefarious economic grab that was already taking place. But if bad theology got us into this, can liberating theology get us out of this? What is the task? Can we recover a liberated Christianity? How do we go about that?
I don't think we know yet, is the answer. This is the sociological answer in me. I think what we do will determine the answer to that question. I don't think it's a theoretical one. I think it's a lived out one. And so I think we'll see. I mean, on the one hand, I would say one thing that gives me hope is being in spaces like this. In the last 3 years, I've probably been invited to 150 churches like this that are predominantly white and trying to have this really challenging conversation. I think that really matters. The other thing I would say is that I think mean people who look like me, raised in the church. Again, it's like blinders, right? We are so like blinded by it that it's hard to kind of get ourselves out of it. And I think one of the things, it's been true for me, this has been true on almost everything I've changed my mind on. And I think it's kind of a human thing. It's relationships, I think, that often will change us. I know for me, like changing my mind on LGBTQ ideas, it was getting to know people who were gay and lesbian, right? And transgender, right? That finally made me go, okay, I got to rethink this. In fact, I remember being in graduate school with a classmate who was gay and kind of realizing they were living a better Christian life than I was, and going, okay, right? Yeah, I got to rethink this a little bit. And I've seen this with kind of whiteness too. Like there's definitely work that white people have to do on their own to deal with whiteness. But one of the things I think we also have to put ourselves in relationship with people who don't look like us. And not just on our terms, but figure out how we can do that in authentic ways. And because it's those things that I think help us see, they expose our assumptions, right? In ways that if we're always around people who look like us, we just kind of merrily roll along, right? With our own assumptions.
Thank you so much. And we have a standing mic up here. And so I just want to encourage folks, as you have questions, if you would like to come to that standing mic and ask Dr. Jones, and he'll answer.
Hi, Lizzie.
Thank you. Is it on? Yep. I want to offer the first question from someone who is online. William Field, one of our leaders in the New Jersey Association, asked, this is perhaps a rather pathetic question, but why do we know so little about the doctrine of discovery?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I asked myself that question, right? So I have a PhD from Emory University. It's one of the top religion programs in the country. I have an MDiv, right? What's that?
I said amen.
Yeah, oh, okay, yes, Emory, yes, shout out to Emory. Have an MDiv, admittedly from a Southern Baptist seminary, but I think that's the power of it, right? Is it's been so intentionally hidden, right? But hidden kind of in plain sight. Where it really first got on my radar screen was from indigenous scholars and writers, in particular, someone whose name you ought to all know, Vine Deloria Jr. If you don't know him, he's like witty and just like cutting and unflinching. Like he wrote a book called Custer Died for Your Sins. In 1969, wrote Custer Died for Your Sins. In 1972, he writes a book or a letter, a missive, and it's just entitled An Open Letter to the Christian Churches of North America. And he just lays this out. And that's 1972, right? He's a professor. He has some standing, but, it really got no serious attention by any kind of white denominational folks at the time. That has beginning to change. But I think one of the things is this: if we take this seriously, I put it this way in the book, like, how do we address a crime so large that it can't actually be righted. And I think one of the reasons to just, deny it is because once you let it in, it's going to ask some very hard questions of us. It's going to ask questions about endowments and church property, right? And institutional property. And as you know, Georgetown, right across town, right, has been wrestling with some of this history as well. So it's going to ask those kinds of questions for us. I think we have been complicit in our own willful ignorance, is the way I would put it, because there's some things you just don't want to know, right?
My name is Lizzie. To add to your diversity, as you were saying, I'm a transgender, autistic, bisexual woman. And in addition to racism in our country, we've also seen xenophobia, such as, when we had COVID, the immigration issues in Angel Island, the Japanese internment camp. So in your research and experience, and as someone who's of Asian background, I'm curious, in your research and work, what has been the impact of white supremacy, especially white Christian nationalism, on AAPI and even Latino groups?
Yeah, thanks for that. So we certainly saw it during COVID. You're right. I mean, where, and in fact, I'm reading Trump's speech transcripts, so you don't have to. But he called the coronavirus the China virus again, just like 2 weeks ago, right? So kind of re-injecting, right, this kind of anti-AAPI kind of thing into our discourse. We of course have a long history. I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the early part of the 20th century, quotas that we set from all kind of Asian countries of who could come in and all of that. So we have this long history of it being there. And again, if you ask yourself, what is the positive vision that all of those things are trying to protect? And I think we have to kind of go back to this idea that this worldview that a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christian country is like what is being protected. That's the vision. And so, I think it's helpful to understand, like the KKK, for example, we think of as just being anti-black, right? But it was also anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish, right? So why was it all of those things? Because it was that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christian vision. The Know Nothing Party also, but it's always been an ethno-religious vision of kind of white Christians that are getting protected. So even like immigrants from Mexico, who are predominantly Catholic, right, don't quite fit that model, right? And so I think that's why there is all of these things kind of line up in a way. I guess the last thing I'll say about this too is that the other piece of this was one of the reasons I so appreciated Isabel Wilkerson's Caste book, because it is hierarchy is at the heart of all of this, right? And that's also what holds us together. So there's a racial hierarchy with white people up here and kind of everybody else in some kind of order down here. There's a religious hierarchy with Christianity up here, and particularly Protestant Christianity up here, and everybody else kind of down here. There is a gender hierarchy with men up here and women down here. And in that vision, there are no other categories, right? It is man, woman, it's binary, that's it. There's a kind of ideal relationship between men and women that's hierarchical, with men above women, and only, right? That's the reason marriage has to kind of fit into that binary vision as well, kind of a patriarchal, hierarchical vision of marriage. So it is this kind of hierarchical vision where human beings were created by God to fit into certain places in this hierarchy, and they ought to stay there. Right, and so of course white straight men are at the top of this hierarchy.
High up here. Hi, can you hear me? Okay, my name is Gail Perry, and I've been in the UCC since I was 12. That was just last year, but but anyway, you talked about one of the ways to start to change this scenario is through relationships. My experience has been when I approach white people about having conversations, instant you bring up race, I'm not comfortable talking about that. And comfort is a big issue. Do you have any ideas how to leap over that? I'm not comfortable talking about race, or total silence.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's been, if you look like me, you have the luxury of not talking about race, all right? And growing up
Yes.
in many ways. So I think that's part of it. There hasn't been, you've had the option, right, of just not talking about it in circles of people who mostly look like you. So I think you're right. So I think, like, it's reminding me of two things. I think discomfort is sort of like a defensive showstopper, and that's political, is the other phrase, right? I don't, in church circles, right? That's political. We can't talk about that here, right? Those are the kind of two showstoppers, I think, that these days, whenever I now hear either I'm uncomfortable with that, or if I hear that's political in a church setting, I immediately think, okay, where's white supremacy, right? Because it's got to be somewhere in the neighborhood of that it's political statement. But I think we got to build up a tolerance for it. I wrote a piece called "The Sacred Gift of White Discomfort" once upon a time, and where I was trying to get at this, because I do think this is the whole argument against like wokeness or critical race theory and not wanting to make our children uncomfortable in classrooms. And of course, we mean white children, right? No, who cares what children of color are feeling, but don't want to make the white ones uncomfortable there. And so I think that, but here's the myth I think behind it that I think hopefully I've been trying to get this around. There's not just shame by facing this history. Like, that's not the only thing on the other side of it. In 2011, for example, I was diagnosed with cancer, stage 3 cancer. Little touch and go, and then they prescribe this treatment, right? And the treatment is not pretty. Chemotherapy, surgery, the whole 9 yards, right? Many of you have either been through it or certainly had families been through it. So why do you sign up for that? It's because you think, okay, if I can make it through, I'm going to be healthy on the other side of it. And right now I'm sick. And I think that it's a lot like that. Like, if we can kind of convince more white people, like, look, we're not well, right? And there's plenty of evidence that we are not well. And I think if we can kind of recognize that, and then recognize like part of the path is facing this stuff, but we do it to be healed, right, at the end of the day. Like, we do it to be free at the end of the day. And so I think that vision, because what's behind all the CRT stuff is that it's nothing but shame you're just going to beat yourself up and feel bad. But that's not what it is at all. And in fact, I would say, like, what we have is like discipleship, right? That's discipleship, to kind of march through that process. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
So another question from online from Margaret Dillner, one of our leaders in Delaware with the Chesapeake Association. She asked, with so much apathy about this election, especially among young voters, how do you suggest we might make the case for such an important election? And many of those young voters are not part of organized religion.
It is a challenge. Historically, it has always been true that church going or people not just churches, but people connected to synagogues and churches and mosques vote at higher rates than people who are not connected to those religious institutions. That gap has been closing over the last, say, 20 to 30 years. Like, there used to be like a 10-point gap between the voting rates of people who were like connected to institutions. And it's pretty practical, right? Because if you're in those institutions, you get reminders about when the election is, and you maybe get a ride to the polls if you need one, like all that stuff. It's not mysterious why that is. But it has been closing in the last, particularly in the last election cycle, where we had people who were religiously unaffiliated voting at rates comparable to the general population for the first time. But it is notable how many of those people there are, right? So today in the country, it's more than a quarter. It's 27% of the country claims no religious affiliation at all. Like, that's not just people who say, I don't go to church or whatever. It's people who when you ask them what their religion is, they say nothing, right? They don't even claim the label. So it's not just they're not coming, they will not claim the label on a public opinion survey. Among young people, it's 4 in 10 who claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. So it's a big group of people. In fact, enough people that certainly could sway the election, right, if they were kind of more involved. I do think that the idea is to just try to focus on, I think, protecting like the democracy, I think is what, is like vitally at stake. And I think focusing on that is, I think, probably the best thing to do with younger folks. It's a harder thing, it's sometimes abstract, but like that's something people have lived and died for, right? And kind of bringing that history forward and saying like that's kind of what's at stake in this election. Yeah. Hello.
Good to see you. I was listening to Diana Butler Bass earlier today, her Ruining Dinner podcast, which I'm a big fan of. But one of the points she was making, this isn't my question, this is about the former question, sorry. But she was talking about the 1980 election and reminding us of how incredibly close, that was the Carter-Reagan election. And John Anderson was the third-party candidate. And he got enough votes that he probably lost it for Carter. So that's where I'm going when I'm talking with young people about third-party candidates or not voting at all. We got Reagan and everything that followed because of 1980. All right, so now my question. My question is, I see white Christian nationalism as playing a huge role in the current, not overseas Gaza situation, but in the Gaza situation as it's being debated and argued about, portrayed, et cetera, in the United States. And I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, so we're getting to the close with another easy one. Here's what's troubling and confusing, I think, is that we currently have, right, in the MAGA movement, simultaneously a kind of Christian version of Zionism and anti-Semitism, both. And in many ways, the anti-Semitism is hiding behind the Christian Zionism. And that's what makes it complicated in the domestic context, I think. And so it's kind of being weaponized in a way. But one thing I will say, I did it's not quite out yet, I'm not sure. I did an interview with NPR Code Switch a week ago about this question of Christian Zionism and how it's playing in the U.S. And basically, the thing that I pointed out and the thing to remember is that version, the sort of Christian version, the evangelical version of Zionism, does not have the well-being of Jewish people at its heart, right? It is a Christian drama. It's a Christian apocalyptic drama in which Jewish people play a bit part, right? With Jesus as the hero at the end, right? And the end times when, all is revealed and Jesus is the Messiah and Jews finally accept Jesus as the Messiah. Like that's the play that's being, put out there. So I think kind of remembering all of that and kind of not letting, what a kind of thin kind of support for Israel like cover the rest of it, I think, and we got to figure out how to talk about that complexity, I think, in order to really get our hands around it. Yeah.
Robert, thank you so much for being here. My name is Mike, and I work at the denominational level for the United Church of Christ. And the question that I've been getting throughout the past year is really, what can churches do? And I think certainly the work that you're doing to raise the profile, to educate the public about this issue is so critical. And I see, some of our churches have engaged this issue in many different ways. We've had churches show up on the front lines at situations like in Charlottesville at the Unite the Right rally. We have got churches that are out there doing vigils on the anniversary of January 6th. But I think we've got clergy that are training to be poll chaplains to de-escalate around the election. And I think there's a real spectrum of what people can do. But I'm curious kind of how you see, how do you see effective ways of responding in addition to education? And then also I guess the other question that I have is, how do we avoid the trap of playing into us and them ideology? I know I've had questions that, from the left, basically like signed up for our version of Take Back Christianity from them. And I deeply want to try to find a way forward that is more intersectional, that is movement-based, that isn't going to further divide our nation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. So on the short term, I think the things you're talking about, like get people to sign up to be poll workers. There's been a great exodus for reasons that are pretty obvious, right? People have been harassed, people have been threatened, and there's been staffing the election is going to be with like trained poll workers is going to be a real challenge. So if you've got people in your congregations that are willing to do that, that is a huge thing they can do for democracy. Clergy as poll chaplains, there's several programs like that. I think that's all really important. On the longer term, like I usually try to start with something like really simple, and it depends on like where a church is on this. But if a church is just trying to get on the path of kind of having this conversation, I usually say to them like, look, if you could just answer this question, it's a good way to get into the conversation. Why is your church on this piece of land in this part of the city, as opposed to wherever else it could be? If it moved, why did it move? If it's been here for 100 years, what was going on, right, when it first got, and for the most part, that gets to race pretty fast, right? It gets to white flight, it gets to redlining, it gets to theft of indigenous land. I mean, if you take it all the way back, it's a pretty concrete local place to start. So if you just kind of think about taking up, let's tell a truer story about why we're here and who we are in this place, like just us. I think that's actually a good long-term place to go, because you can't wiggle out of it, right, so much, or it's not abstract. It's like, no, the building we're sitting in has this legacy, right? The land that we're on has this, and I know the UCC has got like some church audit, kinds of materials and stuff like that. So I applaud that. That's all, I think, super, super important.
Hi, my name is Sarah Strossel-Kagi, and I am the pastor of an American Baptist congregation in southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm here as part of the Young Clergy Conference. Thank you for hosting us here. My question, as you were talking about, one of the things we can do in engaging younger voters is remind them of we're protecting the democracy. And this is a debate that I've had in many of my circles. Like, come on, guys, we have to vote for Biden because look at the alternative. And the pushback that I get from my peers is, yeah, but look what happened under Biden. Like, I have friends who are living in fear for their lives every day under a Democratic president. And it's hard to argue that, right? Like, from my place of privilege, say, oh, yeah, and I know, and we all know it could get worse. So, but what do you say to a generation of voters who have been failed by democracy at every turn? Where is the hope there? Is there hope there? I am a preacher. I want to believe there's hope there. Where is it?
Well, the first thing to say, there's a lot of them, right? The kind of millennial Gen Z, they're huge in terms of numbers. And so I think, part of it is in their hands, and they could take some agency and get involved and all that. And then the other thing I would say is it can get a lot worse. And I have not really used the fascist word until this year, and I'm seriously using that word now, because when we have a candidate who is saying things like, the vermin who are poisoning the blood of our country, like that is straight out of Mein Kampf. Like I looked it up, like it's literally in Mein Kampf. That it can get a lot worse, and it can get a lot worse for people who don't look like me, for sure, which most of that generation does not. And so I think that's important to remember as well. And frankly, we need them. So hopefully, I'm holding out some hope for them too. One other thing I'll say, this may be a little bit controversial, but I've been thinking a lot about it. I think particularly on the progressive side of Christianity, there is the desire, and it comes from like the right place of wanting to like put our arms around everyone, make the tent big. I do think we're going to have to do some discernment in these days about who we fight. And that's a real challenge, right? Because like our... Can you say more about that? Get a little more specific. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, what reason why we're in the discernment is like, if we have a movement that is a like transparently fascist movement, you can't have a big tent with fascists in the tent. Right? And so you're going to have to, I think that's the challenge. It's like we have to figure out like how far can we reach, right, before we're like really bringing a group inside that's going to burn the place down, and make some real difficult decisions about that. And I don't have the 10-point criteria of like knowing where that line is or anything, but I do think I at least want to sort of put in play that a kind of, I feel like it's a little bit of a progressive naivete in some ways, right? Of kind of thinking, and this is where like the ideological divides are, is human nature good? Is human nature bad? Like, all that stuff. But I do think we got to realize that there are some bad actors and people who aren't acting in good faith, and who, don't have the good of the country in mind, or have a vision of the country that's antithetical to democracy. And there's a way in which that has to be defended, right? At the very least, we don't sort of invite them, into the circle if we're trying to protect something that they're trying to burn down.
I'm Linda Escalera. I'm actually from North Carolina. Boy, do we have issues. I am half Mexican. I was raised to believe that we were Spanish because being European was acceptable, being Mexican was not. My question really is, how do we handle those small opportunities? I tend to provoke by the things that I wear. I actually have a shirt that says 11th generation, and I'm the poison you've been warned about. People will ask me about that. When I have an opening, whether it's somebody genuinely wanting to know or somebody trying to just say something in passing to, discredit the kinds of things I'm saying, I don't have a lot of time to engage in that conversation. It's in the grocery line. It's in the parking lot. Are there some ways that we can address some of these in opportunities that you're not going to have to be able to sit down and really have these conversations?
Yeah, I think it's hard in those kind of situations. I mean, I'm going to give away my evangelical background. It's making me think of like the ways, I'm just going to see how many heads will nod when I say chick track. Anybody? Nobody. Wow, I am not in the South. All right. There were these little cartoony evangelism tracts that we would hand out, right? And you would do it in the grocery store line or waiting for the bus, or and it was like a way of it was like hit and run evangelism, right? And you kind of like, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you'd be? Here's the answer, right? And like, have a good day. And so I don't know that it works that well in those settings, because I think what has to happen is, again, I think relationships build trust, and that's important, which you don't have in those kind of chance encounters. A kind of accountability, like if you're in a church community together with people who disagree, there's at least an accountability of sitting in the same pew, right, and being in the same space. And you can't, it puts a limit, right, on how much hostility you can kind of bring toward that other person when you know you're going to see them next Sunday. So I think there's those kinds of accountability things that make a difference. And then I think the other thing is there has to be space to tell stories. I think for me, that's kind of what I've seen work, not just for me, but in other settings. There has to be enough of a relationship where, and time, because I think if we tell a story about our own experience, right? I mean, even the thing you just said, if you hear somebody making an anti-immigrant, their anti-Mexican joke or whatever, and you can say, well, look, let me just tell you a little bit about my upbringing and like why that offends me, right? But because I had this experience. And that's much harder for people to argue with, right? Because it's your story and you own it. And we're just kind of narrative beings anyway. And so I think when people hear, oh, okay, well, I'll think about that some more. And that stories stay with us, right? In a way that arguments don't. Our slogans don't stay with us so much. So I think like those kinds of stories will and looking for opportunities and relationships where we can tell those stories, I think will bit by bit, right? Yeah.
So another question from online. This is from Kelly. Her brief comment and question: our children are our future, and our education system only teaches a fraction of the story of America. How do we encourage the expansion of school curriculum to include the vibrant and all connotations tapestry of American history?
That's a great question. I mean, as you all know, the battle lines, I think, these days are less about policies and more about identity, who we are as a country, what's our history, what's our in the beginning story. That's why I can say the term critical race theory, and those of you that didn't go to law school know what I'm talking about, is because it's entered into our kind of zeitgeist, right? It's a kind of a fault line, a cultural fault line. But that's all about, getting our history right. I will say this, like my son is in Montgomery County, Maryland public schools, and he's taking AP American history. And I was like, okay, let me look at this textbook, right? And I have to say, I was pretty pleased with the textbook, and they are supplementing it with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous History of America. And I mean, I didn't get any of that sort of like stuff, growing up. And so I think it's happening. But then, of course, right, there's Florida and Kansas and other places where they're banning AP African American history and other. But that's a fight over the now. Right, fought on the lines of curriculum. So it is I think it's a really important battle line, because getting that next generation in, like my son, my daughter, who went through that curriculum, they will never like read American history through those like lens of what I call like impossible innocence that I had, like a kind of just thin patriotism, impossible innocence. Where Baldwin has this great line, where, our men were always freedom-loving heroes and our women were always virtuous, and, like all this stuff. Like, that's just not the history most of them are getting. But I think that's why there's a fight over it, because they're getting it. I think in many cases, a better history than we did.
Hi, I'm Susie. Thank you for being here tonight. Strangely enough, on my metro ride here, I was reading the newspaper and read the latest about Justice Alito, and he's been apparently flying the Appeal to Heaven flag all last summer. And I guess I'm just been sitting here listening to you and just thinking, what are we to do when we have a Supreme Court justice proudly and publicly displaying his white Christian nationalism? I mean, and to your point about the young people, I don't know. I understand why they maybe don't have any hope, because that's what they're looking at. And it feels like, wow, where do we go? And I'm really curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's the thing. So just for those of you to catch you up who didn't quite see it, it's come to light that during the insurrection, Justice Alito at his home flew the American flag upside down, which was a symbol of the insurrectionists, and left it there for several days. He's blamed it on his wife and said he had nothing to do with it. But then, of course, we have Justice Thomas, right, whose wife was directly involved in the insurrection. So we got two Supreme Court justices, right, directly connected then to the insurrection on January 6th. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, outside his office, is flying the Appeal to Heaven flag, which is an evergreen tree that historically was used in the Revolutionary War, but has been adopted by not only the insurrectionists, but the sort of like far-right Christian group known as the New Apostolic Reformation and the Seven Mountains Mandate folks, right, that say that Christians should conquer the seven mountains of society: government, business, culture, right? It is a straight-up Christian nationalist symbol now. So it's pretty ubiquitous in pretty high places. And we've got Trump on the campaign trail, this is a religiously interested audience. You should look up on YouTube and watch Trump's address to the National Religious Broadcasters meeting, which is evangelical. It's like all the TBN and the folks and Christian radio folks, because he just explicitly lays out there, right? He said, I'm going to appoint an evangelical person to be an oversight person for every government agency. Right? He just like lays it out in this. This is kind of where I'm going, right? Because we're going to protect God when I'm president. Like that's the rhetoric. So I think that these aren't abstract. I think you're right to kind of hold us to these very concrete ways that it is getting injected, not just out there on the campaign trail, but and we have promises that it's going to get injected actually into the fiber, of the executive branch, the judicial branch, and executive, judicial, and legislative branches. So, yeah. So it's we should be paying attention to that. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Jones, I just want to thank you so much for your time with us. I know there are some books out there, and I wondered if you could let us know what books are out there, and if there's any closing thoughts that you wanted to make before we show you our thanks, show you our gratitude.
Sure, I'll say so. So I think the conversation we have been pretty heavy, and rightfully so. I think it's appropriate. But one thing, the second half of the last book I wrote is the second half of the title is and a path to a shared American future. All right, and so there is a kind of hopeful side to the book, even though we've been talking about kind of the challenges ahead of us. And in the book, what I do is I look at, because I didn't want to just kind of, here's my 10-point plan. I want to actually look at what communities are doing around the country. So I went to 3 places, and more than half the book is actually 3 kind of examination of Mississippi, at the Delta in Mississippi, where Emmett Till was killed, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where just had the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and one not many people know about, Duluth, Minnesota, where there was a lynching of 3 African-American men in 1920, and 10,000 people turned out for this lynching in a town that only had about a tenth of the town. It only has about 100,000 people there. And in all cases, it's not just the kind of event, but what I'm looking at is how the current community is dealing with this past, working to tell the truth, and working to repair the present on the way to a better future.
Looks like we have one more question, so let's take this one last question and then we'll move outside.
I have a theory that Jesus was left-handed dyslexic. Have you ever had discussions about how people's minds are, in particular that, and other leaders? How do you know left-handed mindsets and dyslexic and other places on the spectrum, and why it matters? And we try to be missionaries and reprogram everyone to be in our own image for their own good. But in particular, in politics, since 1945, a lot of American presidents and vice presidents have been left-handed. Overtly, and then the ones who were said to be neurologically left-handed but wrote with their right hand, John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. And Wes Moore, I noticed, is left-handed, and King Charles III is maybe the second ever British king. So it matters. How is your mind, and what do you do with the mind you have, and when do you stress yourself to be conformed to right-handed rules, and why is it other people's business? And I think it is, and we need that discussion. How are we built, and how do we appreciate people grateful that my neighbor is not me and doesn't want to be me? But we don't have that discussion, and it's like cancer. Your inward enemy, your crab within. Everybody gets costs everyone. So how do we get that discussion of who is your neighbor and who is yourself? I just don't hear it where I should.
Well, thank you. Well, my wife is left-handed, so she'll appreciate that. Yeah. And I actually do have, my grandfather was beaten by his teacher, right, because he was left-handed into writing right-handed. So I do think it's part of the hierarchy, right? You could just add to all the hierarchies. It's right over left, right, is the dominant thing. So I appreciate you bringing in that other perspective for us to think about. But I think it is part of that. And it is a kind of, this is the norm, right? And if you don't fit that norm, right, you're down here. And I think that's, again, at the heart of all of this is, right, how do we figure out how we, kind of that shared American future, how do we come up with that? And to kind of use that frame metaphor, I guess I'll end with this, kind of go back to where we have a present that flows fairly easily from an in the beginning where we're all in the frame. So, and with that, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you for making tonight's event possible, but I wanted to also take a moment just to thank some sponsors that have made this event possible. Many of you know this organization. We work closely with them in our Faith and Democracy campaign, Center for Common Ground, and several of our local churches that are represented here. Christ Congregational Church, UCC, thank you, Pastor Matt. Cleveland Park Congregational UCC, thank you, Pastor Ellen. First Church, thank you, Pastor Amanda. Rock Spring Congregational, thank you, Pastor Laura. And Westmoreland Congregational UCC. And then I also wanted to just say thank you to the work that we are collectively doing together as a campaign and the work that we're looking to do in partnership across the United Church of Christ. And I think it's important to recognize our director of our Washington, D.C. office, Reverend Mike Neuroth. You saw him gave a question. So the Faith and Democracy campaign partners with our Washington, D.C. office as part of the denomination's effort called Our Faith, Our Vote. And we are urging each local church that is represented here to show up back here first on June 29th as we pull together a UCC grassroots delegation to be a part of the Poor People's Campaign mobilization on June 29th. We're looking to organize more than 250 people, and we want to engage in some friendly competition. I think People's Congregational Church back in 2022 organized the largest delegation. So if any of you want to try to beat their number, ask me and I'll let you know. But we wanted to lift that up as sort of the next opportunity that we will have to be together in person. So we wanted to encourage you to come back here on June 29th. There's a promotional flyer that's going around encouraging you to RSVP, and then you will be hearing more from both First Church, Faith and Democracy campaign, and the DC office about our collective action on that day. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight for this voter education forum. We look forward to sharing with you more about future voter education forums. And thank you, Dr. Jones, for your time and all the work that you do on this important topic. Thank you. Thank you. So I think Pastor Amanda informed you that before you leave, be sure to get your parking ticket validated. And the space is still open up until 8 o'clock, so feel free if you're still hungry to grab some food and, of course, grab a book or two. Thanks.